In polite society, love is rarely spoken of. It is concealed behind etiquette, measured in glances, and buried beneath what must be endured rather than confessed. Some emotions are permitted, others are performed, and a few are never forgiven. When Lady Eliza Mortimer buried her husband, she did not only bury a man. Beneath the heavy black crape of her mourning, she hid something far more dangerous than grief. Relief. In a world where a widow's sorrow is watched, measured, and judged for the slightest flaw, her survival depended on perfect performance. No hesitation, no misstep, no freedom. Until a duke, accustomed to reading what others conceal, noticed not her tears, but her discipline. Stories like this were never meant to be spoken aloud. They survived only because someone, somewhere, chose not to look away. If you remain for what follows, you are already part of the silence that keeps her safe. And if you wish to continue listening to the lives that history preferred to forget, you may do so quietly by subscribing. No announcement is required, only presence. The funeral of Lord Charles Mortimer was attended by everyone who mattered, and several who did not. This is how one measures importance in polite society, not by affection, but by attendance. The pews of St. George's were filled with those who had dined at his table, borrowed his influence, or simply wished to be seen performing the correct rituals of mourning. Grief, after all, is most convincing when witnessed. Lady Eliza Mortimer understood this better than most. She stood at the front of the church in black so complete it seemed to absorb the pale morning light filtering through the stained glass. Her gown was bombazine, appropriately dull, trimmed with crape that rustled with a particular heaviness when she moved. The fabric was designed to announce mourning before a word was spoken, to make a widow visible in her suffering and thus above reproach. Her veil was thick, double-layered. It obscured her face entirely, reducing her features to shadow and suggestion. This was not an accident. She had chosen it carefully. Through the black gauze, she could see the congregation clearly enough to know they were watching. And they were. Every eye in that church was trained on her with the particular intensity reserved for tragedy and scandal, though only tragedy was permitted here. Not yet scandal. Not if she was careful. Mrs. Hartwell, seated 3 rows back, had her handkerchief ready. Lord Pemberton's jaw was set in that expression men adopt when they wish to appear solemn but are mostly uncomfortable. The younger ladies, those who had not yet married, watched her with something between pity and fear, as though widowhood were contagious. Eliza's gloved hands were folded precisely in her lap. She had practiced this. The angle of her head, slightly bowed. The stillness of her shoulders. Even the rhythm of her breathing had been rehearsed until it appeared natural, slow, measured, the breathing of a woman holding herself together through sheer discipline. Because that was what they expected. A widow in deep mourning was permitted to weep, but not to wail. To tremble, but not to collapse. To show sorrow, but never relief. And Eliza Mortimer felt an overwhelming, suffocating relief. It sat in her chest like a stone she could not swallow, heavy and undeniable. She had woken that morning and realized, with a sharp inward jolt, that she was free. That the man who had made her small and silent and sorry for existing was being lowered into the ground, and she would never have to endure his presence again. The thought was so dangerous she nearly gasped. Instead, she tightened her hands in her lap until her knuckles went white beneath the gloves. The vicar was speaking. His voice rose and fell in that practiced cadence reserved for eulogies, each word carefully chosen to suggest virtue without specificity. Charles had been, according to the vicar, a man of considerable standing and unyielding principles. Both were true. Neither was comforting. Eliza did not listen closely. She had heard these words before, in other churches, for other men. What mattered was not what was said, but what was seen. And what was seen was a widow, veiled and silent, enduring her grief with admirable composure. The service concluded. The congregation rose. Eliza remained seated a moment longer than necessary, another detail she had rehearsed. It suggested she needed time to gather herself, that standing required effort. When she finally rose, it was with the careful slowness of someone barely holding together. Perfect. Outside, the November air was cold and grey. The sort of weather that matched mourning so well it seemed designed for funerals. Eliza stood beside the grave as the coffin was lowered, her hands folded, her head bowed. She did not weep. Tears would have required her to lift her veil to dab at her eyes, and she could not risk that. Not yet. Not while they were watching. And they were still watching. Mrs. Hartwell approached first, reaching for Eliza's hands with a tenderness that felt intrusive. "My dear Lady Mortimer, you have borne this with such grace." Eliza inclined her head. "You are kind to say so." Her voice was quiet, steady. She had practiced that too, how to sound tired without sounding weak, grief-stricken without being incomprehensible. "If there is anything you require, anything at all, you must not hesitate to call upon me." "Thank you." Eliza squeezed the woman's hands briefly, then released them. The gesture was warm enough to seem genuine, brief enough to suggest she could not bear prolonged contact. One by one, they came, offering condolences that sounded identical, squeezing her hands, studying her through the veil as though they might discern the shape of her sorrow. Eliza received them all with the same quiet dignity, the same murmured gratitude. She did not falter once. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat. "Your husband was a man of principle, Lady Mortimer. His absence will be felt." "Indeed," Eliza said softly. She did not specify by whom. Eventually, the crowd thinned. The carriages began to depart, wheels crunching over gravel. Eliza remained at the graveside longer than anyone else, because that was expected. A widow should be the last to leave. A widow should linger, reluctant to part from what remains. So she stood there, alone, as the gravediggers began their work at a respectful distance. And in that moment, veiled, silent, utterly alone, she allowed herself one small, forbidden thought. He is gone. The relief was so powerful it felt like falling. She steadied herself, pressing her hands together until the pressure became almost painful. Then she turned, slowly, and walked back toward the waiting carriage. Her steps were measured. Her posture flawless. No one would ever know. The house was quiet when she returned. Mortimer House had always been quiet. Charles had preferred silence to conversation, order to warmth, but this was a different sort of quiet. The kind that follows departure rather than demand. Eliza removed her gloves in the entrance hall, then her bonnet, but left the veil in place. The servants were watching too, though more discreetly. They had their own suspicions, their own opinions about the late Lord Mortimer, but they would never voice them. Not to her. Mrs. Dawes, the housekeeper, approached with a tray. "Tea, already prepared. You'll want to rest, my lady." "Thank you, Mrs. Dawes." Eliza took the tea into the drawing-room and closed the door behind her. Only then, only in the absolute privacy of that room, did she lift her veil. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror above the mantelpiece. She looked tired, pale, but not grief-stricken. She looked like a woman who had survived something. Eliza set down her teacup and crossed to the writing desk. There were letters to answer, condolences that would arrive by the dozen, each requiring a reply. She would compose them carefully, each one a small performance of sorrow. Because the funeral was only the beginning. The real work of mourning, the year of black, the isolation, the constant scrutiny, was still ahead of her. And if she wanted to survive it, she could not afford a single mistake. She sat down at the desk, pulled a sheet of mourning stationery toward her, and began to write. Outside, the November rain began to fall. Inside, Lady Eliza Mortimer prepared to disappear. There are rules for widows. They are not written in any book one might purchase, nor discussed openly in polite conversation. Yet every woman knows them, passed down through whispered instruction, observed at funerals, absorbed through the careful watching of those who came before. A widow in deep mourning wears only black for the first year. Not charcoal, not grey, black. The fabric must be dull, devoid of sheen. Bombazine and crepe are preferred, their roughness a physical manifestation of grief. Jewelry, if worn at all, must be jet or carved from hair of the deceased. Nothing that sparkles. Nothing that suggests the capacity for joy. She does not attend social gatherings. She does not entertain. She does not walk in public without her veil, and even then, only for necessary errands. The theatre, the opera, the balls that mark the season, all are forbidden. She exists in a carefully prescribed isolation, visible enough to demonstrate proper feeling, invisible enough to avoid impropriety. Most importantly, she must appear diminished. Grief, society insists, should make one smaller. Eliza had studied these rules as though preparing for an examination. Which, in a sense, she was. 3 days after the funeral, she stood before her dressing-room mirror in full mourning attire. The morning light, what little penetrated the heavy curtains she now kept drawn, cast her reflection in shades of grey and shadow. The gown was new. Or rather, newly dyed. Her modiste had worked quickly to transform Eliza's existing wardrobe into appropriate mourning dress, soaking the fabrics in black dye until no trace of color remained. The results were admirably somber. Each dress now hung like a reproach, heavy with crepe trim that whispered with every movement. She had ordered enough black gloves to last months. Handkerchiefs edged in black. Even her writing paper had been replaced with stationery bordered in thick black lines, as though grief must announce itself in every correspondence. Mrs. Dawes had tried to protest the drawn curtains. "It's too dark, my lady. You'll strain your eyes." But Eliza had insisted. A house in mourning should feel like mourning. And more practically, darkness meant fewer visitors. People were less likely to call when a house looked tomb-like. Now, examining her reflection, Eliza practiced. She tilted her head. Too much. That suggested curiosity, alertness. She corrected it, letting her chin drop slightly. Better. She relaxed her shoulders, allowing them to curve inward just enough to suggest the weight she carried. Not a collapse, merely a subtle bowing under invisible pressure. Her hands were the most difficult. They wanted to move with purpose, to gesture, to express. Charles had hated that about her, the way her hands betrayed emotion when her face had learned to remain still. So she had trained them over the years into stillness. Now she folded them at her waist. Too prim. She let them hang at her sides. Too casual. Finally, she settled on a loose clasp at her stomach, fingers barely interlaced. It suggested someone holding herself together gently, carefully, as though any sudden movement might undo her entirely. She practiced the walk. Slow steps, slightly shortened. Not a shuffle, that would be excessive, but a reduction in stride that suggested energy conserved for endurance rather than living. In the mirror, a proper widow looked back at her. Eliza felt nothing but calculation. She lowered her veil, the thick one, for public, and watched herself disappear. The letters arrived in waves. Each morning, Mrs. Dawes brought them on a silver tray. Condolences from distant relatives, expressions of sympathy from Charles's associates, carefully worded notes from women who had never liked Eliza but could not be seen failing to acknowledge her loss. Eliza read each one at her writing desk, the same desk where Charles had once reviewed her correspondence before allowing her to send it. The habit of his surveillance remained even in his absence. She still composed each reply with the sense of being watched, judged, evaluated for correctness. "Dear Mrs. Hartwell, your kindness in my time of sorrow is a comfort I shall not forget. Lord Mortimer's absence is deeply felt, and the warmth of friends such as yourself provides solace in these dark hours. With gratitude, Lady Eliza Mortimer." The words meant nothing. They were a formula, as prescribed as the black dress and the drawn curtains. But they were necessary. Each reply was evidence of her grief, proof that she was behaving as expected. She signed her name with particular care, ensuring the script appeared steady but not strong. A widow's hand should show some tremor, not enough to suggest instability, merely enough to indicate feeling barely contained. Some letters were more difficult than others. Lady Catherine Ashford had written with characteristic bluntness, "My dear Eliza, you must be devastated. Charles was such a formidable man. I cannot imagine the emptiness you must feel." Eliza stared at the word emptiness for a long moment. She felt no emptiness. She felt expansion, as though a constriction around her chest had finally loosened, allowing her to breathe fully for the first time in years. The house was quieter without Charles's criticism, his demands, his cold assessment of her every action. She woke without dread. She moved through rooms without anticipating his displeasure. This was not emptiness. This was relief so profound it terrified her. She picked up her pen. "Dear Lady Ashford, your words capture precisely what I struggle daily to express. The emptiness is, as you say, unimaginable. I am grateful for your understanding during this most trying time." The lie came easily now. She had been lying for years, small lies, necessary lies, the kind that kept peace in a house where peace was purchased with silence and compliance. This was simply one more. On the 5th day, Eliza made her first public appearance. It could not be avoided. There were matters requiring her attention at Charles's solicitor, documents to sign, financial arrangements to confirm. A widow might grieve, but she could not entirely withdraw from practical necessity. She dressed with the same care she had practiced before the mirror. Black gown, black gloves, black bonnet, and a heavy veil that transformed her into a figure rather than a person. Mrs. Dawes accompanied her, improper for a lady in mourning to travel without a companion. The carriage ride was mercifully short. Eliza kept her gaze fixed downward, a posture that served dual purposes. It appeared appropriately somber, and it prevented her from having to acknowledge anyone they passed. The solicitor's office smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Mr. Thornbury rose when she entered, his expression arranged in professional sympathy. "Lady Mortimer, please, sit. I am deeply sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Thornbury." He guided her through the documents with appropriate delicacy, explaining each in tones one might use with a child or an invalid. Eliza signed where indicated, her penmanship deliberately less assured than usual. Men expected widows to be overwhelmed by financial and legal matters. It was easier not to correct the assumption. "Your husband was very thorough in his arrangements," Mr. Thornbury said. "You are well provided for. The house, of course, remains yours, along with an annual income that should more than suffice for your needs. I am grateful for his foresight." The words tasted like ash, but she spoke them smoothly. What she did not say, Charles had been thorough because he trusted no one, least of all her. Every provision in his will was a form of control extending beyond the grave, enough money to live, but tied to conditions. She could not remarry without forfeiting certain assets. She could not make substantial changes to the house. Even in death, he was still dictating the terms of her existence. But she was free of him. That was enough. Mr. Thornbury slid one final document across the desk. "There is the matter of mourning jewelry. It is customary to commission a piece, a ring or a brooch, perhaps, containing a lock of the deceased's hair. A remembrance." Eliza's stomach turned. The thought of wearing Charles's hair against her skin, of carrying him with her in such an intimate way, made her want to tear off her gloves and scrub her hands raw. "Of course," she said quietly. "I shall attend to it." She would order the jewelry. She would wear it when necessary. She would do everything expected of her. Because deviation invited questions. And questions invited scrutiny. And scrutiny would reveal what she could not afford anyone to see. That night, alone in her room, Eliza stood before the mirror once more. She had removed the veil, the gloves, the heavy gown. In her simple nightdress, she looked almost like herself again, the woman she had been before Charles, before marriage, before learning that survival required the death of authenticity. She studied her face, searching for signs of the relief she felt, worried it might be visible somehow, written in her features for anyone perceptive enough to read. But she saw only tiredness. And perhaps, beneath that, something harder. She had spent years making herself smaller, quieter, less. Charles had required it. Society demanded it. And now, in widowhood, she was expected to diminish even further, to become a shadow, a symbol, a cautionary tale about the fragility of women and the tragedy of loss. She could do it. She would do it. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the practiced grief and the careful performance, a small voice asked a question she did not dare speak aloud. How long must I pretend? Eliza turned from the mirror and extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, she allowed herself one moment of truth. She was not mourning Charles. She was mourning the year of her life she would have to spend pretending she was. The invitations stopped arriving in the second week. This was expected. A widow in deep mourning did not attend social functions, so hostesses ceased extending offers they knew would be declined. The silver tray in the entrance hall, once crowded with cream-colored cards edged in gilt, now held only tradesmen's bills and the occasional letter of condolence from distant acquaintances who had only just heard the news. Eliza told herself this was preferable. Fewer obligations meant fewer opportunities for mistakes. She could remain in Mortimer House, safely sequestered, performing her grief for an audience of servants who were paid to be discreet. But by the third week, the silence began to press inward. The house had always been quiet, Charles had insisted on it, but this was different. Before, the quiet had been enforced, artificial, a held breath waiting for his footsteps in the hall. Now it was simply empty. No one called. No one wrote except to express sympathy. Even Mrs. Hartwell, who had promised to check on her regularly, had visited only once since the funeral. Eliza spent her days in the drawing-room, working on needlepoint that required no thought. Black thread on black fabric, creating patterns no one would ever see clearly. It was appropriately mournful work, tedious, joyless, and utterly pointless. Sometimes she read, though even her books had been scrutinized. A widow should read devotional texts, perhaps poetry of a melancholy nature. Nothing too engaging. Nothing that suggested her mind was occupied with anything other than grief and reflection on mortality. She had hidden her novels, the ones with adventure and wit, in the back of her wardrobe. The afternoons were longest. The hours between 3 and 6, when society was most active, felt particularly isolating. She could hear the distant sounds of carriages passing, imagine the calling cards being left at other houses, the tea being served in drawing-rooms where conversation flowed freely. She was not part of that world anymore. The veil had made her invisible. Mrs. Dawes grew concerned. "You should take some air, my lady," she suggested one morning, her tone careful. "Perhaps a walk in the garden. Just to the end of the path and back." Eliza looked up from her needlepoint. "Is that appropriate? In your own garden, properly veiled? I cannot see the harm." But Eliza could. The garden was visible from the street. Someone might see her, might judge whether her pace seemed too brisk, her posture too upright. Grief was meant to be exhausting. A widow should move slowly, heavily, as though the weight of loss made even simple movement difficult. "Perhaps tomorrow," Eliza said. Tomorrow became next week. Next week became never. She told herself she was being cautious, that staying inside was the safest choice. But she knew the truth, the isolation was becoming comfortable. Inside these walls, she could control every variable. No one could ask unexpected questions. No one could look too closely. The veil protected her, not just from judgment, but from connection. And connection was dangerous. The loneliness arrived quietly, like the onset of twilight. At first, Eliza barely noticed it. She had spent years in Charles's company feeling profoundly alone. His presence had been a form of isolation more complete than solitude. So being physically alone felt almost familiar. But as weeks passed, she began to understand the difference. Before, she had been alone while surrounded. Now she was simply alone. No one spoke to her except servants delivering necessary information. No one asked her opinion. No one required her presence. She could disappear entirely and society would nod approvingly. Yes, that is what a grieving widow should do. Fade. Diminish. Become a memory of herself. She found herself standing at windows, watching the street beyond the iron fence. Carriages passed. People walked with purpose, their lives continuing in all the ways hers had stopped. A young woman laughed at something her companion said, the sound bright and uncomplicated. Eliza could not remember the last time she had laughed. Not because of Charles's death, she had not laughed for years before that. Laughter had been dangerous in his presence, always subject to his interpretation. Was she laughing at him? Was she being frivolous? Was she forgetting her place? Easier not to laugh at all. Now, watching that young woman disappear around the corner, Eliza felt something shift inside her chest. Not grief. Not relief. Longing. She longed for conversation that was not scripted. For the possibility of spontaneity. For someone to see her as something other than a figure in black, a symbol of loss, a reminder of mortality. But that was not permitted. So she stepped back from the window and returned to her needlepoint. The worst part was not the isolation itself, but what it revealed. In the absence of external demands, Eliza was forced to confront an uncomfortable question: who was she without performance? She had spent so long being what others required, the dutiful daughter, the obedient wife, the perfect widow, that she no longer knew what remained beneath the roles. When she removed the veil, when she stopped calculating her expressions and gestures, what was left? She was not sure. Late at night, unable to sleep, she would sometimes try to remember the girl she had been before marriage. 17, naive, full of formless hope. That girl had believed marriage would mean partnership, companionship, perhaps even affection. That girl had been a fool. Eliza did not mourn her exactly. But she wondered, sometimes, what that girl might have become if she had chosen differently. Or if she had been allowed to choose at all. Now, at 32, she had a different kind of freedom. The freedom of invisibility. The freedom of being dismissed, overlooked, forgotten. It should have felt like liberation. Instead, it felt like erasure. On the 23rd day, something changed. Eliza was in the drawing room, as usual, when Mrs. Dawes entered with the afternoon post. A single letter, unremarkable in appearance. From Lady Pemberton, my lady. Eliza accepted it with little interest. Another expression of sympathy, no doubt. She opened it mechanically, preparing to add it to the stack requiring replies. But the contents surprised her. My dear Lady Mortimer, I understand you are observing mourning and cannot attend social functions. However, I wondered if you might consider a brief visit here, at Pemberton House? Only myself, no other guests. I have a matter I wish to discuss with you privately, and it cannot be managed through correspondence. I remain, yours sincerely, Lady Pemberton. Eliza read it twice, searching for hidden meaning. A private visit was permissible. Calling on close friends in their homes was acceptable during mourning, provided it was done discreetly and without fanfare. But Lady Pemberton was not a close friend. They were acquaintances at best, civil, but never intimate. Why would she wish to see Eliza now? The letter felt like a test. Or perhaps a trap. But it was also something else, an escape. A few hours outside these walls, engaged in conversation, pretending to be human rather than symbol. Eliza set the letter aside and stared at the cold fireplace. She should decline. It was safer. But the loneliness pressed against her ribs like something physical, and she realized with sudden clarity, the veil that protected her was also suffocating her. She would accept the invitation. Just once. What harm could it do? Duke Alistair Abernathy was not at Lady Pemberton's gathering by choice. He attended because refusal would have required explanation, and explanation required conversation, and conversation was something he preferred to ration carefully. It was easier to appear at select social obligations, remain sufficiently long to avoid offense, and leave before anyone could accuse him of rudeness. This particular afternoon, Lady Pemberton had claimed she needed his opinion on a matter of estate management. It was transparent pretense. She wanted his presence to elevate her small gathering, but he had accepted because the alternative was a parliamentary session that promised to be particularly tedious. Now, standing near the window of her drawing-room with a cup of tea he had no intention of drinking, Alistair observed the assembled guests with the detachment of someone watching a play he had seen too many times. Lord Whitmore was holding forth on hunting. Lady Ashford was attempting to appear interested while clearly planning her exit. The younger Miss Hartwell was practicing the art of strategic laughter, not too loud, not too soft, calibrated to attract attention without appearing desperate. It was all predictable, all performance. Alistair had long ago stopped expecting authenticity in social settings. People showed what they wished to be seen, concealed what they feared would be judged, and the truth, if it existed at all, lived in the spaces between words. He had become skilled at reading those spaces. It was not a talent he had cultivated deliberately. Rather, it was the inevitable result of spending years watching people perform while claiming sincerity. Politicians promising reform while protecting their interests. Friends offering loyalty while calculating advantage. Even family members expressing affection while expecting something in return. Eventually, one learned to stop listening to words and start watching everything else. The way Lady Ashford's smile never reached her eyes. The slight hesitation before Lord Whitmore agreed with something he clearly opposed. The careful angles at which people positioned themselves, toward those who mattered, away from those who didn't. It was exhausting, truthfully. But it was also useful. Alistair had just decided he had stayed long enough when Lady Pemberton appeared at his elbow. "Your Grace, how kind of you to come. I trust you're finding the conversation stimulating." "Adequately so." She laughed as though he had made a joke. "You are too severe. But I'm glad you're here. I have someone I'd like you to meet. Or rather, reacquaint yourself with." Alistair suppressed a sigh. This was always the real purpose of these invitations. Someone's niece needed suitable introduction. Someone's daughter required a titled partner for dinner. He had perfected the art of polite disinterest, present without being encouraging. "Lady Mortimer has just arrived," Lady Pemberton continued. "You remember her, surely? Her husband passed recently. Poor thing is observing mourning, of course, but I thought she might benefit from some quiet company." Alistair glanced toward the drawing-room entrance. A woman stood just inside, dressed entirely in black. Her veil was heavy enough to obscure her features completely, and she held herself with the particular stillness of someone who wished to occupy as little space as possible. He did remember her, vaguely. Charles Mortimer's wife. She had been present at functions over the years, always quiet, always beside her husband. Alistair had paid her little attention. There had been nothing particularly remarkable about her except perhaps how thoroughly unremarkable she had seemed determined to be. "I see," Alistair said. "Would you be so good as to speak with her? Just briefly. I worry she's too isolated, but one must be careful with widows. They're so easily overwhelmed." Lady Pemberton drifted away before he could decline. Alistair remained by the window, watching Lady Mortimer from across the room. She had been intercepted by Mrs. Hartwell, who was speaking with animated sympathy while Lady Mortimer stood perfectly still, her veiled head inclined at precisely the angle society expected of grief. It was well done, that performance. Perhaps too well done. Something about her absolute stillness caught his attention. Most people, when standing, made small unconscious movements, shifting weight, adjusting posture, fidgeting. Lady Mortimer did none of these things. She stood as though she had calculated the exact position and was holding it through sheer will. Discipline, not devastation. Interesting. He watched as she extricated herself from Mrs. Hartwell with a murmured word and moved toward a chair positioned slightly apart from the others. She sat with the same careful control, her gloved hands folding precisely in her lap. Alistair found himself crossing the room. "Lady Mortimer." She looked up, though the veil made it impossible to see her expression. "Your Grace." Her voice was quiet but steady. Not the trembling whisper of someone barely holding themselves together, but the measured tone of someone who had decided exactly how she would sound and was executing that decision perfectly. "I hope I'm not intruding," Alistair said. "Not at all." He sat in the chair adjacent to hers, not too close, but near enough for conversation. For a moment, neither spoke. Around them, the drawing-room hummed with chatter, but their corner felt oddly separate. "I was sorry to hear of your husband's passing," Alistair said, "because it was expected." "You are kind to say so." There was something carefully neutral in her response. Not grateful, not dismissive, simply acknowledgement that the ritual words had been spoken and she had provided the ritual reply. Most widows would have elaborated, would have spoken of their loss, their struggle, invited sympathy. Lady Mortimer offered nothing beyond the minimum required. "Are you finding people sufficiently considerate?" he asked. A pause. Brief, but noticeable. "Yes. Everyone has been most generous with their concern." Generous. An interesting word choice. It suggested obligation rather than comfort. "Mourning must be particularly difficult in winter," Alistair continued. "The darkness compounds the isolation, I imagine." "I had not considered it that way." Another pause. "Though I suppose you're correct." She was being careful. Each response was measured, giving nothing away. Most people filled silence with elaboration, with explanation, with the unconscious need to be understood. Lady Mortimer filled it with control. Alistair shifted tactics. "I noticed you took the chair furthest from the fire. Are you not cold?" Through the veil, he thought he detected a slight turn of her head, surprise, perhaps, that he had noticed something so small. "I prefer the cooler air," she said finally. "It helps with clarity." Clarity. He let the word hang between them. An unusual priority for afternoon tea. Perhaps. She was not going to elaborate. Would not be drawn into revealing more than she chose to give. It reminded him of negotiating with particularly skilled diplomats, the ones who understood that information was currency and silence was strategy. "I find most social gatherings require a certain amount of endurance," Alistair said. "Even under normal circumstances." Another pause. "Yes." That single word carried weight. Agreement, but also something else, recognition, perhaps. As though she understood exactly what he meant and was surprised he had said it. "Lady Pemberton means well," he continued, "but her definition of kindness and its actual effect are not always aligned." This time, he was certain he detected a change in her posture. The smallest relaxation, as though she had not expected honesty. "That is an astute observation, Your Grace. I have been subjected to her kindness on numerous occasions. One learns to recognize the pattern." Silence again. But this silence felt different. Less guarded, perhaps. Or at least, guarded in a different way. "I should not keep you," Lady Mortimer said finally. "I'm certain there are others who require your attention." "No one requires my attention, Lady Mortimer. That is the advantage of being a duke. People assume I'm occupied with important matters even when I'm merely avoiding conversation." He thought, though he could not be certain, that she almost smiled. "Even so," she said. Alistair rose. "Of course. I hope you find Lady Pemberton's concern less overwhelming than I fear it may be." "I shall manage." He believed her. Whatever else Lady Mortimer might be, she was clearly someone accustomed to managing. As he walked away, Alistair found himself considering the widow in black who gave away nothing and yet, somehow, revealed everything through that very omission. Most people performed grief with excess, tears, trembling, dramatic sighs. Lady Mortimer performed it with subtraction, with absence, with such careful control that the control itself became visible. She was hiding something, perhaps many things. And for reasons he could not quite articulate, Alistair found himself curious about what lay beneath that heavy veil. Not the grief society expected. Something else entirely. Eliza did not expect to encounter the Duke again. Their brief conversation at Lady Pemberton's had been pleasant in its peculiarity. He had not offered sympathy, had not asked probing questions, had not treated her as though she were made of something fragile that might shatter with too direct an address. But men like the Duke of Abernathy did not make habits of seeking out widows in mourning. There was nothing to be gained from such association. So when she saw him 3 days later in Hatchard's bookshop, she assumed it was coincidence. Eliza had ventured out only because she needed something to read that was not devotional poetry. The isolation had become unbearable, and books, at least, were company that asked nothing of her. She had chosen an hour when society was unlikely to be abroad, late morning, when ladies of consequence were still at home and gentlemen were occupied with more important matters than browsing literature. The shop was blessedly quiet. Only a handful of patrons moved among the shelves, and Eliza had positioned herself in the back corner where philosophy and natural history resided, sections unlikely to attract casual browsers. She was examining a volume on botanical illustration when she heard a voice behind her. "I would not have taken you for someone interested in plant taxonomy." Eliza turned. The Duke stood a respectful distance away, a book in his own hands. He looked as though he had been there for some time, not as though he had just arrived. "Your Grace." She inclined her head slightly. "I find the subject orderly. There is comfort in systems of classification." "Certainty," he said. "Everything in its proper place, correctly named." "Yes." He moved closer, though not uncomfortably so, and gestured toward the book she held. "Henderson's work is thorough, though somewhat dense. If you're seeking something more accessible, Thornton's illustrations are superior, and his descriptions less technical." Eliza hesitated. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her about something other than her widowhood. "You are familiar with botanical texts?" "I have a conservatory at Abernathy Hall. It requires some knowledge to maintain properly, and I dislike delegating what I don't understand." "That seems a rare perspective among men of your position." "Perhaps." He paused, then added, "though I suspect you share it." Eliza felt something tighten in her chest. He was watching her too closely, seeing too much. She should deflect, should return to the expected script of Mourning Widow. Instead, she heard herself say, "I am not permitted many activities at present. Reading is one of the few remaining acceptable pursuits." "Then it should be reading you enjoy, not reading that's merely appropriate." It was such a simple statement. Yet it felt almost radical. "Enjoyment is not currently a priority," Eliza said carefully. "No, I suppose it wouldn't be." He did not sound sympathetic, merely observational. "Though I imagine boredom is worse than grief, in some ways. Grief at least demands attention. Boredom simply drains time of meaning." Eliza stared at him through her veil. No one spoke like this. No one acknowledged that mourning might be tedious rather than devastating, that the performance of grief might be exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with actual loss. "That is an unusual perspective," she managed. "Is it?" The Duke tilted his head slightly. "Or is it simply an honest one that most people lack the courtesy to voice?" Before she could respond, he gestured toward the shelves. "The travel narratives are on the other side. If you find botanical classification too orderly, Captain Cook's accounts of the South Pacific offer considerably more chaos. Though they're also considerably longer." "You seem to have surveyed the entire shop." "I come here often. It's quieter than my club and requires less performance than most social obligations." Performance. He had used that word deliberately, Eliza was certain. "And yet you're speaking with me," she said. "Which is surely a form of social obligation." "Speaking with you is voluntary. That's the distinction." Voluntary. As though he had chosen this interaction, sought it out even. Eliza felt a flutter of something she could not name, not attraction exactly, but recognition. The sense of being seen not as a symbol or a tragic figure, but as a person capable of conversation beyond condolence. "I should not keep you," she said, though part of her wanted him to stay. "You're not keeping me. I was finished browsing and was considering whether to purchase anything. Your presence has merely made the decision more complicated." "How so?" "If I leave now, I appear to be fleeing. If I stay, I risk someone noticing we've been conversing and drawing conclusions neither of us would prefer." He was right, of course. A widow in mourning speaking with a duke, even in a public bookshop, would invite speculation. Especially if that widow appeared too engaged, too present, not sufficiently diminished by grief. "Then you should go," Eliza said. "Should I?" "Yes." But neither of them moved. The moment stretched between them, peculiar and fragile. Around them, The bookshop continued its quiet business, pages turning, footsteps on wood floors, the soft murmur of the clerk assisting another customer. Finally, the Duke inclined his head. "I hope you find something worth reading, Lady Mortimer." "Thank you, Your Grace." He turned to leave, then paused. "The botanical text is serviceable, but if you truly want something engaging, there's a copy of Mary Wollstonecraft's Letters from Scandinavia 3 shelves down. Impeccably appropriate, travel, natural observation, maternal devotion, and far more interesting than taxonomy." Before she could respond, he was gone. Eliza stood very still, her gloved hands gripping Henderson's botanical text. He had not asked about Charles, had not inquired about her grief, had not offered sympathy or spoken in the hushed, careful tones people used around widows. He had simply talked to her about books, as though she were capable of having interests beyond mourning. Slowly, Eliza returned the botanical text to its shelf and moved 3 shelves down. The Wollstonecraft was there, exactly as he'd said, bound in brown leather, well worn from reading. She pulled it from the shelf and opened to a random page. Nothing, in fact, can equal the beauty of a northern summer evening, and night, far from being dark, is a sort of twilight that has an indescribable charm. Eliza closed the book carefully. Then she took it to the counter and purchased it. That night, alone in her room, Eliza read by candlelight until her eyes grew tired. The letters were everything he had promised: intelligent, observant, occasionally sharp. Wollstonecraft wrote about landscape and society, about the treatment of women in different cultures, about motherhood and independence and the quiet violence of conventional expectations. It was the first thing Eliza had read in weeks that felt like oxygen. She had almost forgotten this, the pleasure of encountering a mind through prose, of feeling less alone because someone, somewhere, had put into words something true. When she finally set the book aside, she found herself thinking not about Wollstonecraft, but about the Duke. He had known what she needed before she did. Not comfort, not sympathy, not careful distance. Conversation. Real conversation, about something other than loss. It was such a small kindness, and yet it felt enormous. Eliza extinguished the candle and lay in darkness, listening to the house settle around her. For the first time since Charles's death, she felt something other than relief or fear. She felt curiosity. Not about the Duke exactly, though he was part of it, but about what might be possible if she allowed herself to be seen, just slightly, as someone other than a grief-stricken widow. If she permitted one conversation without performance. If she stopped hiding entirely and allowed herself to simply be. The thought was terrifying. It was also irresistible. They did not plan to meet again. Yet somehow, they did. Eliza encountered the Duke 5 days later in the British Museum. She had gone to view the Elgin marbles, one of the few public outings considered appropriate for a widow. Art, particularly ancient art concerned with mortality and the divine, was sufficiently solemn to avoid impropriety. The gallery was cold and echoing, filled with fragments of a civilization that had believed itself eternal. Eliza stood before a metope depicting a centaur and lapith locked in combat, studying the way the sculptor had captured violence in marble, the tension in muscles, the strain of bodies pushing against each other. "They never finished this one properly," a voice said beside her. She did not startle. Somehow, she had known he would be there. "Your Grace." "Lady Mortimer." He stood at a careful distance, hands clasped behind his back, his attention apparently fixed on the sculpture. "See how the centaur's face is less detailed than the lapith's? The back was left rough, never polished. It was meant to be viewed from one angle only, high on the Parthenon. What we see now was never intended to be seen." "Then perhaps we're doing it a disservice," Eliza said quietly, "examining what should have remained partial. Or perhaps we're seeing it more honestly than the Athenians ever did." She turned that over in her mind. "You come here often as well." "When I require perspective. Ancient civilizations have a way of making contemporary concerns seem temporary." "Is that comforting or depressing?" "Both." He moved slightly to view the sculpture from a different angle. Depends on the day. They stood in silence, two people ostensibly studying marble, actually aware of each other with an intensity that felt almost improper. "Did you finish the Woolstow neckcraft?" he asked finally. "Yes." "And it was." Eliza paused, choosing words carefully. "Illuminating." She writes about constraint in ways that feel uncomfortably familiar. "I thought you might appreciate that particular quality." He thought. Past tense. Meaning he had considered her specifically when recommending it, had anticipated what would resonate. "Thank you," Eliza said, "for thinking of me at all." Something shifted in the space between them. An acknowledgement, unspoken but present. "Have you read much else recently?" he asked. "I am currently attempting Milton. It seems appropriately grave." "Paradise Lost." "Yes." "Dreadful choice. All that theology and very little actual plot. Satan is the only interesting character, which rather defeats Milton's purpose." Eliza felt something dangerous rising in her chest, the urge to laugh. She suppressed it, but not quite quickly enough. A small sound escaped, barely audible. The Duke heard it. She knew because he went very still. "You should not make me laugh," Eliza said quietly. "It's inappropriate." "My apologies." He did not sound apologetic. "Though I would argue that finding Milton tedious is simply honest literary criticism, not a moral failing." "Society would disagree." "Society disagrees with most things worth saying." They moved together through the gallery, maintaining proper distance, speaking in low tones that would seem perfectly respectable to any observer. Yet something about the conversation felt subversive. They were not discussing her grief. They were not observing the performance expected of widow and duke in public space. They were simply talking. About art. About books. About the peculiar way museums made one feel simultaneously significant and utterly insignificant. "Do you find it strange," Eliza asked, "that we preserve fragments? That we build entire institutions around pieces of things that were meant to be whole? No stranger than the way we preserve memories. Also fragments, also incomplete. But we pretend memories are whole. We tell ourselves we remember accurately." "Yes." He glanced at her, though her veil prevented true eye contact. "We're all rather committed to our own versions of things." Another silence. This one felt weighted with meaning neither of them would articulate. "I should continue my viewing," Eliza said, though she did not want to. "Of course." But neither moved. "Lady Mortimer," the Duke said finally, "I wonder if I might ask you something." Eliza tensed. Here it would come, the question about Charles, about her marriage, about her grief. The inevitable intrusion. "Yes." "Are you finding mourning what you expected?" Not the question she had anticipated. More dangerous, somehow. "I'm not certain I knew what to expect," she said carefully. "No. I suppose one couldn't." He paused. "It seems a peculiar torture, being required to perform grief publicly while actually experiencing it privately. The two must interfere with each other considerably." Eliza's breath caught. He had come so close to the truth without actually stating it. "I manage," she said. "I'm certain you do. You seem remarkably skilled at managing." It should have sounded like criticism. Instead, it sounded like recognition. "Is that admiration or accusation, Your Grace?" "Observation. I have no interest in judging what people do to survive." Survive. Not endure. Not mourn. Survive. He understood. Perhaps not the specifics. He could not know about Charles's cruelty, about the relief buried beneath her black crape. But he understood that mourning was not simply sadness. That it was strategy. That she was navigating something more complex than grief. "You are very perceptive," Eliza said quietly. "A liability, generally. People prefer not to be seen clearly." And yet you persist in seeing them. Not everyone. Only those worth the effort. The words hung between them, impossible to misunderstand. Eliza felt panic and something else, something warm, dangerous, entirely unwelcome. I should go, she said. Yes. This time she did move, walking toward the gallery exit with measured steps. She felt his gaze following her but did not turn back. Only when she reached her carriage did she allow herself to breathe fully. He had not asked about Charles. Had not demanded explanation. Had simply offered, what? Understanding. Permission. The space to exist without constant justification. The encounters continued. Not frequently. Not planned. But with enough regularity that Eliza began to suspect they were not entirely accidental. A week later, she saw him at a concert, one of the subscription series considered appropriate for widows. He was seated across the hall, and their eyes met briefly before she looked away. After the performance, as she waited for her carriage, he appeared beside her. Handel is always safe, he said without preamble. Safe. Appropriately solemn. Sufficiently elevated. No one can accuse you of enjoying it too much. I did enjoy it. I know. That's why you left before the applause. So no one would see you smile. Eliza stared at him through her veil. You're very certain of yourself, Your Grace. No. I'm certain of you. The carriage arrived before she could respond. 3 days after that, she encountered him in the park during the 1 hour she permitted herself to walk, early morning, when society was still abed. They walked parallel paths, never quite together, never quite apart. Speaking occasionally. Mostly silent. It should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt like the most honest interaction she had experienced in years. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of things neither would say: recognition, curiosity, the careful building of something that had no name because naming it would make it dangerous. This is becoming noticed, Eliza said one morning, as they watched mist rise off the Serpentine. Does that concern you? It should. That's not what I asked. Eliza turned to face him. Even through the veil, even with the distance between them, something passed between them that felt more intimate than touch. Yes, she said finally. It concerns me, but not enough to stop. He said nothing, but his expression shifted, satisfaction, perhaps, or relief. They remained there until the sun rose higher and the paths began to fill with other walkers. Then, without another word, they parted. But Eliza knew she would see him again. And she knew, with a certainty both thrilling and terrifying, that each encounter was bringing her closer to something she could not name. Something that felt remarkably like freedom. The whisper began at Lady Ashford's afternoon tea. Eliza was not present. Widows in deep mourning did not attend such gatherings, but Mrs. Dawes heard about it from Lady Ashford's housekeeper, who heard it from one of the parlour maids who had been serving when the conversation occurred. Lady Mortimer was seen speaking with the Duke of Abernethy, Mrs. Hartwell had said, her voice pitched at that particular volume that suggests discretion while ensuring maximum audibility. At the British Museum. They appeared quite engaged. Surely not, someone replied. She's in mourning. Precisely. Which makes it rather concerning, doesn't it? Mrs. Dawes relayed this information to Eliza with obvious discomfort, wringing her hands as she spoke. I thought you should know, my lady. People are talking. Eliza sat very still at her writing desk. What, exactly, are they saying? That you've been seen. Multiple times. With His Grace. That perhaps. Mrs. Dawes trailed off, unable to finish. That perhaps I am not sufficiently grief-stricken. Eliza supplied. That I am seeking inappropriate attention while my husband is barely cold in his grave. Something of that nature, yes. Eliza set down her pen with great care. Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Dawes. After the housekeeper left, Eliza remained at the desk, staring at the half-written letter before her. She had known this would happen. had predicted it, even. The moment she allowed herself those conversations, those brief encounters, she had risked exactly this. Society's attention was a dangerous thing for a widow. Widows were meant to fade. To grieve quietly, exist minimally, demonstrate through sustained suffering that their husbands had been worth mourning. Any deviation, any sign of life, interest, engagement with the world, was evidence of insufficient devotion. And insufficient devotion raised questions. Had the marriage been less perfect than it appeared? Had she perhaps not loved her husband as deeply as expected? Was she, possibly, even relieved by his death? Eliza felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The fear that accompanied any threat to her carefully maintained performance. She should stop. Should cease her morning walks, her visits to museums and bookshops, her chance encounters that were no longer quite so accidental. Should retreat fully into Mortimer House and remain there, invisible and irreproachable, until society forgot she existed. But even as she thought it, she knew she would not. Could not. Those conversations with the Duke had become necessary in a way she had not anticipated. They were the only moments in her week when she felt like herself, not a widow, not a performance, simply a person capable of thought and response. Giving them up would be a kind of death, which meant she needed to be more careful. Not absent, but strategic. The second whisper came 3 days later. Eliza learned of it from Lady Pemberton, who called unexpectedly one afternoon. Her expression was carefully arranged in concern, but her eyes held something sharper. "My dear Lady Mortimer, I felt I must come myself. As your friend." They were not friends. But Eliza received her with appropriate gratitude, offering tea she knew would not be accepted. "I have heard some talk," Lady Pemberton continued, settling into the drawing-room's most prominent chair, "about you and His Grace, the Duke of Abernathy." "Have you?" Eliza kept her voice neutral. "People are wondering why a man of his position would seek out a widow's company so frequently. It's most unusual. And you must understand, given your mourning, any attention is improper, conspicuous." Lady Pemberton leaned forward. "You know how society is. They watch widows especially carefully. Any suggestion that you are not properly devastated, that you might be seeking consolation elsewhere." The implication was clear. Society was prepared to believe the worst. That Eliza was using her widow's weeds to attract a duke's attention. That her grief was performance, her mourning a calculated strategy. Which was, ironically, partially true, though not in the way they imagined. "I assure you," Eliza said carefully, "there is nothing improper in my conduct. The Duke and I have exchanged brief pleasantries on a handful of occasions. Nothing more. I'm certain that's all it is. But appearances, my dear. Appearances matter more than truth, as you well know." After Lady Pemberton left, Eliza stood at the drawing-room window, watching her carriage depart. She had been warned. Politely, but unmistakably. Cease your association with the Duke, or face consequences. The third whisper reached the Duke himself. Alistair learned of it at his club, where Lord Whitmore approached him with the calculated casualness of someone delivering information meant to appear accidental. "Heard an odd thing yesterday," Whitmore said, settling into the chair beside Alistair's. "About you and Charles Mortimer's widow." Alistair did not lower his newspaper. "Did you? Apparently you've been seen conversing with her. Multiple occasions. People are beginning to wonder about your intentions." "My intentions are my own concern." "Ordinarily, yes. But she's a widow in mourning. Rather vulnerable to speculation. Thought you'd want to know that tongues are wagging." Alistair finally looked up. "Let me be clear, Whitmore. I have no intentions regarding Lady Mortimer beyond occasional civil conversation. If society finds that scandalous, society needs better entertainment." Whitmore raised his hands in mock surrender. "No offense intended. Simply thought you should be aware. For her sake, if not your own." After Whitmore departed, Alistair sat with his newspaper unread in his lap. He had been careless. Not with propriety, their encounters had been entirely appropriate. But with frequency, with visibility. He should have known that a duke speaking repeatedly with a young widow would attract notice. Should have predicted that society, bored and perpetually hungry for scandal, would construct meaning from ordinary interaction. The reasonable course was clear: withdraw. Let sufficient time pass. Allow Lady Mortimer to complete her mourning in peace. And yet, he thought of her standing before the Parthenon sculptures, speaking about fragments and wholeness. The intelligence in her voice, the carefully controlled emotion. The sense that she was drowning in expectations and their conversations were the only time she could breathe. Abandoning her now would confirm everything society suspected. Would leave her isolated, exposed, vulnerable to exactly the scrutiny she had been so carefully avoiding. But continuing would make everything worse. Alistair set aside his newspaper and stared at the fire. There was no good answer. Only choices, each with consequences. They met one final time, 4 days after the whispers began. Eliza had not planned it. She had decided, in fact, to stop her morning walks entirely. But old habits were difficult to break, and the walls of Mortimer House had become suffocating. So she found herself in the park at dawn, telling herself she would simply walk once around the Serpentine and return home. The Duke was already there. They saw each other from a distance. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Eliza walked toward him. Deliberately. Choosing this. "You've heard," she said when she reached him. "Yes." "They're watching now." "They are." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unspoken. "I should withdraw," Alistair said finally. "For your protection." "I know. But I find myself reluctant to do so." Eliza looked at him, really looked, as though memorizing this moment. "Why?" "Because I think you need someone who sees you clearly, who does not require you to be smaller than you are." The word struck something deep inside her. She felt tears threatening, the first genuine tears since Charles's death, and fought them back. "What I need," she said quietly, "is irrelevant. What I require is safety, and your presence threatens that." "Then I will go." "Yes." Neither moved. "Lady Mortimer." "Don't." Eliza held up one gloved hand. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." Alistair nodded once. Formal. Final. Then he turned and walked away. Eliza stood beside the Serpentine, watching him disappear into the morning mist. The veil concealed her face, but could not conceal the way her hands trembled. She had made the right choice. The safe choice. The only choice that would preserve what remained of her reputation. So why did it feel like losing something she had not known she could have? She turned toward home, her steps slow and measured. Behind her, the park continued its quiet morning rituals, birds calling, leaves rustling, the city beginning to wake. And Eliza Mortimer returned to her carefully constructed isolation. Alone again. Safe again. Invisible again. The veil, once more, doing its work. The scrutiny did not diminish with the Duke's absence. If anything, it intensified. Eliza had assumed that once she and the Duke ceased their encounters, society would lose interest. That the whispers would fade, replaced by newer, more interesting scandals. She had miscalculated. Society, having noticed her once, continued to watch. And now they watched not for impropriety, but for proof that the impropriety had occurred. Every gesture was examined for evidence of secret attachment. Every public appearance was analyzed for signs of clandestine communication. The veil that had once made her invisible now made her conspicuous. Mrs. Hartwell called unexpectedly one afternoon, her expression arranged in maternal concern. "My dear Lady Mortimer, I felt I should check on you. You seem strained." Eliza received her with practiced composure. "I am managing as well as can be expected." "Of course you are. You've always been so admirably controlled." Mrs. Hartwell paused, letting the word hang with particular weight. Perhaps too controlled, some might say. I'm not certain I understand. Only that grief is meant to be felt, not merely performed. And when one appears too composed, people begin to wonder if the grief is genuine. There it was. The accusation, delicately wrapped in concern. Eliza was being too controlled, too precise. Her performance had been so flawless that it had become suspicious. I grieve in my own way, Eliza said quietly. I'm sure you do. But perception, my dear. Society judges what it sees, not what it cannot. After Mrs. Hartwell departed, Eliza stood in the center of her drawing room, understanding with perfect clarity what had just occurred. She was trapped. If she maintained her composure, she was insufficiently grieving. If she allowed any emotion to show, it would be interpreted as longing for the Duke. If she retreated further into isolation, it would suggest she had something to hide. If she emerged more publicly, it would appear she was seeking attention. There was no correct choice. Every option confirmed suspicion. The performance that had protected her was now exposing her. 3 days later, the whisper evolved into accusation. Lady Pemberton hosted a small gathering, ostensibly for charity work, actually for gossip, and the subject of Lady Mortimer arose with calculated inevitability. I do worry about her, someone said. She seems so very alone. Alone by choice, surely, another replied. She's refused every offer of companionship. Except the Duke's. Silence. Waited. Deliberate. One wonders, Lady Ashford said slowly, whether perhaps her marriage was not quite what we assumed. Charles was a difficult man. Exacting. Some might say cold. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting nothing. Merely observing that a woman who fails to mourn with sufficient passion might have reasons beyond scandal. Perhaps she is simply relieved. The word dropped like a stone into still water. Relieved. The forbidden emotion, finally spoken aloud. Mrs. Hartwell, who was present, immediately reported the conversation to Eliza. She did so with obvious reluctance, wringing her handkerchief as she spoke. I thought you should know what's being said, my lady. It's most unjust, of course. No one who knew Lord Mortimer could think you anything but devastated by his loss. But Eliza heard the uncertainty in her voice. The question beneath the reassurance. Were you devastated? Or were you relieved? After Mrs. Hartwell left, Eliza sat very still. They were circling the truth. Not the truth about the Duke, that had been incidental, a convenient explanation. But the deeper truth, that her grief was performance. That her marriage had been endurance. That Charles's death had freed her rather than destroyed her. If society concluded that, if the whispers hardened into consensus, she would be ruined. Not socially destroyed, that required more dramatic transgression. But permanently marked. Forever suspect. The widow who had not loved her husband enough to grieve properly. She would become a cautionary tale. A figure of pity and disapproval. And worse, far worse, they would have been right. The Duke learned of the new accusations from his sister, who cornered him at a family dinner. Alistair, what have you done? I've done nothing. You spoke with Lady Mortimer. Repeatedly. And now she's being torn apart by gossips who have decided she's either your secret paramour or a woman who never loved her husband. Possibly both. Alistair set down his wine glass with deliberate care. I conversed with her. Briefly. In public spaces. There was nothing improper. Propriety is irrelevant when reputation is at stake. Surely you understand that. He did understand. And he was furious, not at his sister, but at the mechanism that made such destruction possible. That a few conversations, entirely innocent, could be weaponized against a woman already struggling to survive. What would you have me do? He asked. Stay away from her. Let it die down. I am staying away. It's not helping. His sister studied him with uncomfortable perception. You care about her. It was not a question. Alistair did not answer. Could not answer. Because the truth was complicated and acknowledging it would make everything worse. Yes, he cared. Not in the way society assumed, not with romantic passion or scandalous intent. But he recognized something in Lady Mortimer that felt uncomfortably familiar. The exhaustion of constant performance. The suffocation of expectations that allowed no deviation, no authenticity, no space to simply exist. He had spent his entire life navigating similar constraints. The requirements of his title, the expectations of his position, the constant surveillance that came with being a duke. He had found ways to create small freedoms within those constraints. But Lady Mortimer had no such options. Her imprisonment was total. And his presence, meant to offer respite, had instead added chains. "I need to fix this," Alistair said quietly. "You cannot fix it. The damage is done. The only thing you can do is give her space to recover." She was right. He knew she was right. But leaving Lady Mortimer to face this alone felt like abandonment. Eliza stopped leaving the house entirely. For 2 weeks, she remained in Mortimer House, seeing no one, accepting no visitors beyond Mrs. Dawes. The curtains stayed drawn. The rooms stayed dark. She told herself this was strategic, that by withdrawing completely, she would demonstrate proper grief, would show society she had been misunderstood, that she was genuinely devastated, appropriately isolated. But the isolation felt different now. Before, it had been protection. Now it was punishment. She sat in the drawing room, day after day, with needlework in her lap that remained untouched. The veil lay beside her, discarded. There was no one to see her, no one to perform for. And without the performance, without the constant vigilance, she was forced to confront what remained. Anger. She was angry at Charles for dying and leaving her this mess. Angry at society for making survival so complicated. Angry at herself for being weak enough to seek those conversations with the Duke, for allowing herself to want something beyond safety. But mostly, she was angry that relief, the one honest emotion she felt, had to remain hidden. That she could not simply be glad her husband was gone without being condemned for it. The marriage had been cruel. Charles had been cruel. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have been visible or actionable, but in small, daily erosions of her autonomy, her confidence, her sense of self. He had criticized everything, her opinions, her interests, her expressions. Had controlled her correspondence, her wardrobe, her movements. Had made her feel that her very existence was an imposition he tolerated rather than welcomed. And when he died, she had felt nothing but profound, overwhelming relief. That was the truth. The truth she could never speak. The truth that would destroy her if discovered. So she sat in her darkened drawing room and continued the performance. Continued the lie. Continued existing in the narrow space society had allocated for acceptable widowhood. But something had broken. Some essential mechanism that had allowed her to maintain the pretense. She was so tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of measuring every word and gesture. Tired of being watched and judged and found wanting by people who had never lived inside her marriage, never felt what she had felt. Tired of surviving when she wanted to live. One evening, alone in the darkness, Eliza made a decision. She could not continue this way. Could not endure another 6 months, another year, of this suffocating existence. Something had to change. Either society had to stop watching, or she had to stop caring that they were. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Eliza recognized the handwriting immediately. Bold, economical, unmistakably his. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Lady Mortimer, I understand you have withdrawn from society entirely. I understand why. I also understand that my presence contributed to your current difficulties, and for that I am deeply sorry. However, I find I cannot leave matters as they stand. If you are willing, I would like to speak with you. Not in public, I would not subject you to further scrutiny. But privately, at your convenience, at a location of your choosing. I have no expectations. I simply wish to offer what assistance I can, if any assistance is wanted. Yours, Abernathy. Eliza read it 3 times. The reasonable response was refusal. She had spent 2 weeks reconstructing her reputation through absolute isolation. Seeing the Duke now, even privately, risked everything. And yet, she was so tired of being reasonable. She picked up her pen. They met in the conservatory at Mortimer House. Eliza had chosen the location deliberately. It was private, no servants entered without being summoned, but it was also neutral ground. Not a drawing room designed for social performance, not a bedroom that would suggest impropriety. Simply a glass-walled room filled with plants Charles had collected and Eliza had maintained. She waited there at the appointed hour, still wearing her black dress but without the veil. That decision had been deliberate as well. When the Duke arrived, shown in by Mrs. Dawes with obvious disapproval, he stopped at the threshold. His gaze found hers immediately, and she saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or relief that she had trusted him enough to appear as herself. Lady Mortimer. Your Grace. She gestured toward a chair. Please, sit. He did, though his attention remained fixed on her face. It was disconcerting, being seen so directly after weeks of hiding. She resisted the urge to look away. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Alistair said. I was not certain you would. I nearly didn't. Eliza folded her hands in her lap, the old gesture of control, then deliberately unfolded them, letting them rest at her sides. But I find I am tired of hiding. From society. From everything. The words hung between them, more honest than she had intended. Alistair leaned forward slightly. I came to apologize. My presence in your life, however innocent, has caused you considerable harm. That was never my intention. I know. And to ask, quite directly, what I might do to repair the damage. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. You cannot repair it. Society has decided I am either your secret lover or a woman who did not love her husband. Possibly both. Nothing you do will change that narrative. Then I will publicly declare the truth. That our conversations were entirely proper. That anyone suggesting otherwise is engaging in malicious gossip. That would only confirm their suspicions. A duke defending a widow's honor suggests the honor requires defending. Alistair's jaw tightened. Then what? I cannot simply stand by while you're destroyed for the crime of speaking with me. Why not? Eliza's voice was sharper than intended. That is precisely what society expects. For you to walk away unscathed while I bear the consequences alone. I don't accept that. Your acceptance is irrelevant. It is simply how things are. Silence fell between them, tense and uncomfortable. Finally, Eliza stood and walked to the conservatory windows. Beyond the glass, the November garden was grey and dormant. She could see her reflection faintly in the glass, a woman in black, features drawn with exhaustion. Do you know what the worst part is? She said quietly. They're right. Not about you, we've done nothing improper. But about my marriage. About my grief. She turned to face him. I am not devastated by Charles's death. I am relieved. Profoundly, overwhelmingly relieved. And I have spent every day since his funeral hiding that truth because if anyone discovered it, I would be ruined. Alistair said nothing. Simply watched her with that same unwavering attention. The silence gave her permission to continue. My marriage was not violent. Not in ways anyone would recognize. But it was cruel. Charles made me small. Made me silent. Made me believe that my thoughts, my interests, my very existence was an inconvenience he tolerated rather than welcomed. Her voice cracked slightly. And when he died, I felt nothing but relief. And that relief is the most dangerous thing I've ever felt. She waited for judgment. For shock. For the inevitable withdrawal that came when people saw unpleasant truths. Instead, Alistair stood and crossed to where she stood. "I know," he said simply. Eliza stared at him. "What?" "I know. I've known since our first conversation." He paused. "You were too controlled. Too precise. Grief makes people chaotic. You were performing perfect containment, which suggested you were containing something other than grief. And you said nothing." "What was there to say?" "That I recognized your performance because I've spent my entire life performing as well." He smiled faintly, without humor. "We are all performing, Lady Mortimer. The only difference is that your performance was scrutinized more carefully than most." Eliza felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had been holding for so long she had forgotten it was there. "You're not horrified," she said. "That I'm relieved rather than grieving. I'm angry that you had to hide it. That relief from cruelty is somehow more scandalous than the cruelty itself." The words were so exactly what she needed to hear that Eliza felt tears threatening. She blinked them back, but not quickly enough. Alistair noticed. "You don't need to maintain composure with me. I don't know how to do anything else." "Then learn." It was not a command. It was an invitation. Eliza took a shaking breath. Then another. And with each breath, she felt the careful architecture of her performance begin to crumble. Not dramatically. Not with collapse or confession. Simply with the gradual recognition that she did not need to perform here. Not with him. "I cannot continue as I have been," she said finally. "Hiding in this house, measuring every gesture, living in constant fear of being discovered. It's unbearable." "Then stop." "Society will gossip regardless of what you do. You cannot control their narrative. You can only control whether you allow that narrative to imprison you." Spoken like someone who has never been at society's mercy. No. Spoken like someone who has been at society's mercy and learned that their power only extends as far as you permit. Eliza wanted to believe him. Wanted to imagine that she could simply stop caring, stop performing, stop hiding. But she was not a duke. She was a woman with no family, no title, no protection beyond the reputation she had spent years cultivating. "I have nothing if society turns against me," she said quietly. "You have yourself." Alistair met her gaze steadily. "Which is more than you've had in years." The truth of it struck her like a physical blow. She had spent so long being what others required that she had forgotten who she was beneath the roles. Wife, widow, performance. But underneath all of that, who was Eliza Mortimer? She did not know. But perhaps, for the first time, she had the freedom to find out. "I'm frightened," she admitted. "I know. What if I cannot do this? Cannot face their judgment?" "Then you retreat. But at least you'll have tried." He paused. "And you won't be alone." Eliza looked at him, really looked. Saw not a duke offering protection, but a person offering presence. Companionship without expectation. Understanding without judgment. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk your reputation for mine?" Alistair considered the question carefully. "Because I think you're remarkable. And I think you deserve to exist as yourself rather than as society's approved version of yourself." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have." They stood in the conservatory as afternoon light filtered through glass, two people who had spent years performing finally allowing themselves to be seen. Eliza reached up slowly and touched her face, her own face, unveiled, exposed. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "Neither do I. But you'll stay. As long as you'll have me." It was not a declaration of love. Not a promise of rescue. It was simply presence. And for Eliza, it was enough. The scandal did not dissipate immediately. Society, having invested considerable energy in speculation about Lady Mortimer and the Duke, was reluctant to abandon the narrative. Whispers continued. Invitations remained conspicuously absent. Mrs. Hartwell called less frequently, and when she did, her manner suggested duty rather than friendship. But something had shifted. Eliza stopped waiting for vindication. Stopped measuring her days by whether society approved or disapproved of her existence. She began, instead, to simply exist. Small changes, at first. She opened the curtains. She walked in the garden at midday rather than only in the early morning when no one could see. She ordered new books without considering whether they were appropriately somber. Mrs. Dawes noticed the transformation with obvious relief. "It's good to see you emerging, my lady." Emerging. Yes. That was what it felt like, not recovery, but emergence. As though she had been underground and was finally surfacing into light. The Duke called regularly now. Not clandestinely. He arrived at proper hours, stayed appropriate lengths of time, conducted himself with absolute propriety. If society wished to make scandal of it, they would have to work considerably harder. They did not speak of love. Neither of them used the word, made declarations, suggested futures. Instead, they built something quieter and more substantial. Companionship. 3 weeks after their conversation in the conservatory, Alistair arrived with a package. "I brought you something," he said, settling into the chair that had become his in the drawing room. Eliza accepted it with curiosity. Inside was a book, worn, clearly read multiple times. "Montaigne's Essays," she said, reading the spine. "I thought you might appreciate his perspective on grief. He writes about the death of his friend, Nobility, with remarkable honesty. No performance. No claim that grief is noble or purifying. Simply acknowledgement that loss is complicated and people feel what they feel." Eliza opened to a marked passage and read aloud, "I am not prepared to take death to heart with such excessive grief as many people do." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Did you mark this for me?" "I marked it years ago. For myself. But yes, I thought of you when I decided to bring it." She set the book aside carefully. "You're very skilled at this." "At what?" "At seeing what people need before they know they need it." Alistair considered this. "I think rather that I pay attention. Most people don't." "Why do you pay attention?" "Because nothing interesting happens on the surface. The truth is always underneath, in what people don't say. In the spaces between performed emotion and actual feeling." Eliza smiled, a real smile, unguarded. "You make it sound like investigation." "It is, in a way. Though investigation suggests I'm searching for evidence of wrongdoing. I'm simply searching for truth." "And when you find it, what then?" "That depends on the truth. And the person." He paused. "In your case, I found someone performing survival while being criticized for not performing grief convincingly enough. Which struck me as profoundly unjust." "So you decided to, what? Rescue me?" "No. I decided to offer you the space to stop performing. There's a difference." There was. Eliza understood that now. Rescue implied helplessness, implied that she could not save herself. What Alistair had offered was something else entirely: recognition, permission, presence without expectation. "I'm grateful," she said quietly. "You don't need to be grateful. This is not charity." "Then what is it?" Alistair met her gaze steadily. "It's whatever you want it to be." For weeks after that, Eliza made a decision. She would attend a small musical evening at Lady Pemberton's. Not a grand ball, she was still in mourning, but a private concert appropriate for widows in the later stages of grief. Mrs. Dawes fussed over her dress, her gloves, her veil. "Are you certain you're ready, my lady?" "No," Eliza said honestly. "But I'm going regardless." When she arrived, the drawing room fell briefly silent. Eyes turned toward her, assessing, judging. She felt the familiar panic rising, the urge to make herself smaller, to apologize for existing. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked to an empty chair. Lady Pemberton recovered first. "Lady Mortimer, how lovely to see you." Thank you for the invitation. The concert proceeded. Eliza sat with her hands folded, her posture correct, her veil in place. But something was different. She was not performing grief. She was simply present, listening to music, existing in the same space as others without apologizing for it. Halfway through the second piece, the Duke arrived. He had not been expected. His presence at such small gatherings was rare. But there he was, accepting Lady Pemberton's flustered welcome and taking a seat across the room. His gaze found Eliza's. A brief acknowledgement. Nothing more. But it was enough. She was not alone. And more importantly, she no longer needed someone else's presence to validate her own. After the concert, as guests milled about with tea, Mrs. Hartwell approached. Lady Mortimer, you seem well. I am well enough. It's good to see you rejoining society. We were worried. Were they? Or were they simply disappointed that their speculation had yielded no dramatic conclusion? Eliza chose kindness. Your concern is appreciated. As Mrs. Hartwell moved away, the Duke appeared at Eliza's side. That was diplomatically handled, he murmured. I'm learning to navigate conversations that are performance rather than connection. From a master, I see. She laughed, softly, but genuinely. Several heads turned at the sound. Let them look, Eliza thought. Let them wonder. She was done hiding. 6 weeks after that, on a cold January afternoon, Alistair asked her a question. They were walking in the park, unchaperoned now, but with enough distance between them to remain proper. The scandal had faded to background noise. Society had found newer, more interesting subjects. I've been thinking, Alistair said, about what comes next. Next. Your mourning will end eventually. You'll be expected to make decisions about your future. Eliza felt her chest tighten. Are you asking me something specific? Not yet. I'm simply acknowledging that at some point, I will. He paused. And I want you to know, whatever you decide, whenever you decide it, I will respect that decision. Even if I decide I prefer to remain alone. Even then. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps crunching on frozen ground. I don't know what I want, Eliza admitted finally. For so long, I've been told what to want, how to be, what to feel. I'm not certain I know how to decide for myself. Then take time. Decide nothing until you're ready. And you'll wait. I'll be here. Not waiting, that implies passivity. Simply being here, as I have been. Eliza stopped walking and turned to face him. Why? You could have any woman you chose. Someone uncomplicated, undamaged, without scandal. I don't want uncomplicated. I want honest. His expression was serious, intent. You are the most honest person I've ever met, Eliza. Not in what you say, you've spent years lying out of necessity, but in who you are beneath the performance. That person is remarkable. And that person is who I want to know. It was the first time he had used her given name. The intimacy of it struck her more powerfully than any declaration. Alistair, she said, testing his name on her tongue. He smiled. Yes. I don't need you to save me. I know. But I would like you to stay. Then I will. It was not a proposal. Not a promise of forever. It was simply presence. Continued, chosen, without expectation beyond itself. And for Eliza, it was everything. Spring came gradually that year. The black dresses remained in Eliza's wardrobe, but she began to add grey, then lavender. The veil was worn less frequently, then only on formal occasions, then not at all. Society adjusted. Found new scandals, forgot old ones. Eliza Mortimer, once the widow everyone watched, became simply Eliza. A woman who walked in parks, read extensively, attended concerts, and was occasionally seen in the company of the Duke of Abernathy. What they were to each other remained delightfully unclear. Friends, certainly. Perhaps more. Society could speculate all it wished. Eliza no longer cared. She had learned that freedom was not the absence of judgment, but the refusal to be defined by it. And she had learned that love, real love, was not rescue or performance or the fulfillment of expectations. It was simply being seen, clearly and honestly, and choosing to remain anyway. On a warm afternoon in late April, Eliza stood in her conservatory, tending the plants Charles had collected and she had kept alive. Alistair was coming for tea. They would talk about books, perhaps about politics, maybe about nothing important at all. And that simple, unremarkable afternoon felt like everything she had been denied for years. Not grand passion. Not dramatic transformation. Simply the freedom to exist as herself. Unperformed. Unafraid. Finally, beautifully, free. Some stories end with weddings. This one does not. Not because there will be no wedding. There may be, eventually, when Eliza decides she wants one. But because the story was never about marriage. It was about a woman learning to exist without performance, and that lesson does not conclude with a ceremony. It continues, quietly, in the ordinary days that follow. 18 months after Charles Mortimer's death, Eliza stood in the drawing-room of what was no longer quite Mortimer House. She had not changed the name officially, but the house had changed nonetheless. Curtains opened daily now. Books lined shelves that had once held only approved texts. The drawing-room hosted small gatherings, intimate conversations with people Eliza had chosen rather than inherited. Mrs. Dawes had adjusted to the transformation with pragmatic acceptance. "It's good to see the house alive again, my lady." Alive. Yes. That was the difference. Eliza had spent so long existing in spaces designed to contain her, her father's house, then Charles's, then the tomb-like silence of widowhood. Now, finally, she inhabited space rather than being confined by it. She entertained guests on her own terms, declined invitations without apology, spoke her opinions without first calculating whether they would be acceptable. Society had not collapsed at her audacity. Some had disapproved, certainly. Mrs. Hartwell had grown distant. Lady Ashford had made pointed comments about propriety. But others, younger widows, women trapped in similar performances, had begun to seek her company. To ask, carefully, how she had managed to simply stop caring what others thought. Eliza told them the truth. She had not stopped caring. She had simply decided that her own approval mattered more than theirs. It was a lesson that could not be taught, only learned through practice. Alistair had become a fixed presence in her life. Not constant, he maintained his own household, his own obligations. But regular, reliable, present in ways that felt chosen rather than obligated. They had still not married. He had asked, finally, 6 months earlier. Not with grand gesture or public declaration, but quietly, in her conservatory, surrounded by plants and afternoon light. "I would like to marry you," he had said. "Not because society expects it, not because your mourning has ended, but because I want to build a life with you. If you want that as well." Eliza had considered the question carefully. Marriage to Alistair would be nothing like marriage to Charles. She knew that. He had proven it through years of respectful companionship, of seeing her clearly without demanding she be anything other than herself. But marriage itself still carried associations. Still suggested surrender, subordination, the loss of self that had nearly destroyed her the first time. "I'm not ready," she had said finally. "Not because of you. Because of what marriage means. What it requires. Then we won't marry. You're not disappointed. I'm patient. And I would rather have you as you are, unmarried and present, than married and diminished." So they had continued as before. Companionship without contract. Love without legal binding. Society had opinions, naturally. A widow of means living independently, accepting the attentions of a duke without accepting his proposal, it was irregular. Perhaps even improper. Eliza found she could live with irregular. On a September afternoon, 2 years after Charles's death, Eliza received an unexpected visitor. A young woman, recently widowed, who had heard that Lady Mortimer might understand her situation. "They tell me I should be devastated," the woman said, twisting her handkerchief. "And I am trying. I wear the black, I follow the rules. But I feel relief." Eliza supplied gently. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Yes. And I'm so ashamed." Eliza recognized herself in those words. The shame of feeling the wrong emotion, of surviving when society demanded you suffer. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Eliza said firmly. "Grief is not a debt you owe the dead. And relief from cruelty is not a sin." "But what do I do? How do I endure a year of this performance when every moment feels like a lie?" Eliza poured tea, considering her words carefully. "You survive it however you can. You follow the rules enough to stay safe. And you find small spaces, conversations, books, moments alone, where you can be honest with yourself even if you cannot be honest with society. And after, when the mourning ends, you decide who you want to be. Not who you were expected to be. Not who your husband wanted you to be. Who you actually are." The young woman left looking less desperate, though still uncertain. Eliza understood. Survival was not a single decision but a series of small choices, made daily, to continue existing despite the weight of expectations. She had made those choices, was still making them, and slowly, incrementally, they had accumulated into freedom. That evening, Alistair arrived for dinner. They ate in the small dining room, conversation flowing easily between literature and politics and the minor scandals of the season. After, they moved to the drawing room. Alistair settled into his chair, the one that had become his through repeated occupation, while Eliza stood by the window, looking out at the garden. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she said without preamble. Alistair went very still. "Have you?" "Yes." She turned to face him. "And I think I might be ready. Not immediately, but soon." "What changed?" "I realized that my fear of marriage was not actually about you. It was about losing myself again. Becoming smaller." She paused. "But I've spent 2 years learning to take up space. Learning to exist without apology. I don't think marriage to you would require me to unlearn that." "It wouldn't," Alistair said quietly. "I have no interest in a wife who performs contentment. I want a partner who is actually content. And if that requires unconventional arrangements, so be it." Eliza smiled. "Society will have opinions." "Society always has opinions. We simply no longer have to care." She crossed the room and sat beside him, not in her own chair, but on the arm of his. Close enough to touch, but maintaining her own space. "When I marry you," she said, "it won't be because I need rescue. Or because mourning has ended and marriage is the expected next step. Why will it be? Because I choose it. Because I want to build something with you that neither of us could build alone." Alistair reached for her hand. She gave it. "Then we'll build it," he said simply. There would be a wedding, eventually. Small, private, attended by the few people who actually mattered rather than the many who merely believed they should be included. Eliza would not wear white. She had no interest in performing virginal purity at 34. She would wear something elegant and her own, in a color she chose because she liked it. There would be no veil. Society would gossip, of course. Would say she had never properly mourned her first husband, that her second marriage proved she had been scandalous all along. Eliza would not attend to their gossip. She had learned, finally, that other people's narratives about her life were irrelevant. That she could not control what they said or thought, could only control whether she allowed their judgments to define her. And she had decided, firmly, irrevocably, that they would not. Years later, when people asked about Lady Abernathy, they would say she was peculiar. That she read extensively, spoke her mind, maintained her own household even after marriage. That she hosted salons for women writers and collected botanical specimens and occasionally appeared at Parliament to observe debates, which was highly irregular for a duchess. They would say she had never properly mourned her first husband. They would be right. But they would never understand why. Would never know about Charles's quiet cruelty, about the years of making herself small, about the relief that had been more dangerous than grief. And Eliza would not explain. She owed them nothing. Not performance. Not explanation. Not the story of her survival. That story was hers alone. And she had finally learned, after years of being watched, measured, and found wanting, that her own understanding of her life was the only one that mattered. The ton had recorded what they could see. But what remained, what truly mattered, lived in the spaces they had never been meant to observe. In quiet conversations. In chosen companionship. In the freedom to exist without apology. In love that required no rescue. In a life, finally, authentically lived. Some loves are never spoken of. Others are remembered. And when it is often too late, too quiet, or too costly to be celebrated aloud. If this story felt like love to you, not the kind that dazzles, but the kind that endures, then you already understand what many never will. Stay. Not just for happy endings, but for honest ones.